My name is Edmund Lewis from Winchester College, and I'm going to be talking to you about the Thucydides prescription in classical Greek for first teaching this September 2021. My aim is to, above all, convince you to teach this text because I think it's absolutely wonderful, but perhaps you've already chosen, in which case I hope that you'll learn some interesting things that will be of use when preparing and teaching the text. So the battle strategy is laid out as follows. Just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the background, some essential things to know before we dive in about Thucydides and about the Peloponnesian War. Then a few more minutes looking at the resources that are available, which are very, very good. And the lion's share of the talk will be a talk through of the prescription of group 1, above all looking at the group 2 prescription as well, before at the end we consider some possible questions that pupils might be asked and some extension work possibilities as well. So the background, Thucydides is an Athenian historian. He's an Athenian politician as well, and general indeed, who lived from about 460 to 400 BC. So he was an adult when the Peloponnesian War broke out in 431, and he outlasted the Peloponnesian War. Though his narrative does not outlast the Peloponnesian War, it breaks off mid-sentence in 411 famously, but he does refer to the end of the war and events towards the end of the war in his work. So we know that he didn't just drop dead halfway through 411. His history has been divided into 8 books. We're obviously talking about book 6, but those divisions are unlikely to have been his doing, which is significant, as we'll see in just a second. Before we move forwards, though, just going to admire this wonderful picture. It's a Roman copy of a Greek original of a double-sided Herm. More on Herms later, but there's Thucydides on the right, back to back with Herodotus, who of course is his contemporary. Herodotus slightly older, but they're living in Athens at the same time. Thucydides, a native of Athens. Herodotus is just living there from Halicarnassus in southwestern Turkey originally. Okay, so what about this whole book division business? Well, I mention it because books 6 and 7 are often seen as a sort of standalone component of Thucydides because they together make this coherent narrative of the Sicilian expedition, which is it runs from 415 to 413. The Peloponnesian War, if you like, restarts in 415 BC. There was a peace treaty between Athens and Sparta in 421, known as the Peace of Nicias, though Thucydides himself very much refuses to see it as 2 separate wars. He thinks it is one continuous war, even if theoretically the sides were at peace. And I do encourage you and your pupils to read the whole of 6 and 7, but we've got to be slightly careful about this, seeing the beginning of book 6 as a cutoff, because we would miss something very important, which is how book 5 ends. It ends with a very famous part of Thucydides called the Melian Dialogue, and then Athens' capture of this island of Melos and cruel treatment of its inhabitants, the execution of all the males, adult males, and the enslavement of the women and children. So it's perhaps the great war crime of that Athens commits, an anachronistic term, of course, in the Peloponnesian War. And it is immediately followed by this line: during the same winter, the Athenians wanted to invade Sicily with a bigger armament than that under Laches and Eurymedon. You're into the beginning of book 6. So there's a juxtaposition between the desire to go to Sicily and Athens' ultimate hubristic act, cruel act. And Sicily's going to go so badly wrong. I think we're encouraged to see a link there, which you'll miss if you only start at the beginning of book 6. So yes, but 6 and 7, the Sicilian expedition, okay, more broadly, is a coherent and dramatic narrative And that's one of the reasons why it crops up so often on syllabuses, both at A-level and at universities. So it's great. We're lucky to have it on the syllabus. So let's enjoy it. This word dramatic, I use it both in the normal sense of the word, but Thucydides there's a lot of inter-genre allusion in 5th century literature. And Thucydides is definitely an interesting text to put alongside Greek tragedy, to an extent comedy as well. I could have said it is an epic narrative because it owes a lot to Homer as well in how he depicts it. I get this in early because Thucydides has a bit of a reputation, completely undeserved, as being quite a dry author. But in fact, it is about the most rich literary text that you could imagine. If you're not convinced of that already, I hope you might be as we go forward. So it's a great text to be studying at A-level and to be introducing to your pupils. Okay, let's talk about resources. This anthology is the single most valuable resource. I would definitely get all your pupils copies of it because it is really, really very good indeed. The section on Thucydides by John Clawton has got a fantastic introduction, both on Thucydides and on the historical context on the Peloponnesian War. And then the commentary itself is excellent. It's got, as you'd expect, a few historical notes, but lots of help with translating difficult bits. We all need that with Thucydides, and also some great points on style as well, which I'm sure will be very useful. Not exhaustive, but will get you into the right frame of mind. John Clawton clearly benefited from the other commentaries available, above all the two that I would recommend to you: Dover's short commentary on Thucydides' book 6. I mean, it's not that short, but compared to the historical commentary of Thucydides that came out in 1970, it is the shorter of the two, and it is just the right length for our purposes. I think, again, great introduction, and it's particularly good on the style of Thucydides' Greek, so things to look out for when you're looking for style points, but also the language of Thucydides and how that differs from other authors that you may have studied or may go on to study. Then the Hornblower commentary is an absolute masterpiece, volume 3, weighing in at about 1,100 pages. It's really good, and it is incredibly accessible as well. And the discussions of difficult bits like the tyrannicide episode that forms part of the Group 2 prescription are really, really interesting and impressive. So make sure you as a teacher have access to those two commentaries. I wouldn't give either to the pupils, definitely not the Hornblower one, but you might want to scan a few bits here and there, and if you're using OneNote or the equivalent in Google Classroom, that's a really good way to share them with the pupils. Such things we have learned in recent years. Other resources, 2 more books, but the best translation I think is this Martin Hammond one in Oxford World Classics. It's both very elegant and very close to the Greek, and there's an excellent introduction by P.J. Rhodes. The obvious rival is the Penguin, Rex Warner. Again, I think a very elegant translation, but it is not all that close to the Greek, so it's not desperately useful if you're trying to relate the Greek to. It's not very useful as a crit, is what I'm trying to say. And then this book, Thucydides by W.R. Connor, W. Robert Connor, I think is, to me, my single favourite general book on Thucydides. It is as it says on the blurb, a full-scale sequential reading of Thucydides' history. It's a literary reading, if you like. And I recommend reading the whole thing, but it's got a chapter per book. And the one on book 6 is going to have lots of materials that is highly relevant to teaching these texts. So do look that up. And it is the ultimate antidote to this theory that Thucydides is dry as dust. Okay, and a few other slightly more random things. If you haven't come across The War That Never Ends, almost no one has, so you probably haven't, which was 1991 BBC dramatisation of Thucydides, highly recommended. You can see Pericles there, played by Ben Kingsley. The Naxos audiobook on Thucydides is great. It is in 6 CDs, so clearly highly abridged, but it doesn't abridge any of the individual speeches, for example, and it includes all 3 speeches from the Sicilian debate at the beginning of book 6, which could be a good teaching resource. And if you're looking for a wonderful map to put on your wall, which helps you illustrate what's going on in the Peloponnesian War, these ones that you can get on Redbubble, the print-on-demand website, Sayawari's map of Greece in 431 BC is great. So let's look at this prescription. You might be choosing between the group 1 and group 2 prescription. I don't know how many people there are who are planning to double down and do both. I will be arguing that they're both great prescriptions, but the group one is the obvious one to go for. That said, I would, even if I only choose to do group 1, I definitely prepare my pupils to do the essay, which would entail reading the group 2 prescription in English, and indeed the subsidiary parts set in English. If you add all of those together, you get a natural unit of the first bit over the first half, first 3/5 of book 6, chapter 1 to chapter 61. Or if you want to specialize a little bit more, 8 to 32 and then 42 to 61. So we'll see what those are in a minute. Yellow here indicates that this passage is not set either in Greek or English at all, but the first 7 chapters of book 6, you're going to want to read, particularly chapter 1, this sort of bolt from the blue that the Athenians are interested in invading Sicily. And the Sicilia, as it has been called since antiquity, the Sicilian matters, a sort of prehistory of Sicily and the settlement from various different places, eventually Greece, of course, is highly redolent of the archaeology at the beginning of book 1 of Thucydides, and it's often said that this is Thucydides trying to suggest that this is a whole other war, in addition to the rest of the Peloponnesian War that the Athenians are taking on here. And it's tying into this sense that we get very early on that this is an enormous undertaking, and one that could go very badly wrong for Athens. Great. Then we get the assemblies. Of the first assembly is just a few lines, and then the second assembly, where they sort of reconsider whether they should go to Sicily, is treated much more fully, much in the manner of the Mutilation debate in book 3 of Thucydides. You've got Nicias's first speech. He's saying, look, we shouldn't go to Sicily after all. It's not a good idea. It's just because Alcibiades wants some glory and a get-rich-quick scheme because he spends too much time and money on his chariots. Then Alcibiades' reply. Nicias is going to reply again, but that's actually in group 1 prescription. This is what's there in asked to be read in English. And the main themes for this wonderful bit of the text is, again, setting up filling in a bit more about why Athens is going to Sicily, and how maybe that decision is not a fully wise one, because both speakers reveal an incomplete grasp of what Sicily is going to be like, we're going to discover. But I think the main theme is actually the characterization of Nicias and Alcibiades, both figures who are going to appear a lot in our prescription. So I think that's going to be one of the obvious essay questions, as we'll come and see at the end. An important passage for comparison is 265 early in Thucydides, the so-called obituary of Pericles, where he talks about how Pericles had given good service as a political leader in Athens, and none of his successors were up to the job. So Nicias and Alcibiades are clearly some of the leaders that Pericles had in mind when he said that. So good to go back and read that passage. Okay, so we then get on to what's actually set for the group 1 prescription. I can be looking at this in a bit more detail in a minute, but for now, what I want you to see is just how varied a prescription this is. Roughly have 4 units here. You first of all have the end of the assembly speech and Nicias' second speech, in which he tries to the tactic of trying to make it sound like it's too big a hassle to go. So therefore hoping that the Athenians will drop the idea. So that's great. You've got a speech basically. And then you have the speech backfiring and preliminary preparations being made, the army called up, this sort of stuff. So, and at the same time, the different motives of different elements in Athenian society, the young versus the old, and this sort of thing. That's quite an interesting few chapters, very different in feel, looking at Athenian politics and society. And then you have the mutilation of the Herms, and the parody of the Eleusinian mysteries. So you have this sort of panic in Athens when the Herms, we'll talk about them in a second, are discovered to have been mutilated quite soon before the expedition breaks off. Fascinating insight into Athenian religion and society and politics. And finally, the departure of the fleet. Beautiful description of all these triremes readying themselves to go off to war. This is one of the great set pieces in all of Thucydides, and is a pleasure to read. So you've got a lot of variety in one set text. So let's go for that. What happens after that? Well, we then fly off to Syracuse, and unaccountably, this is not set even in English, but is such an important passage for understanding, for setting up the rest of the Sicilian narrative, because it turns out that what we see in Syracuse is so similar to what we saw in Athens. It's a debate, a three-way debate, if you like, 3 speeches, just like we had 3 speeches in the Sicilian debate in Athens. Hermocrates, who's quite a competent politician with some good ideas about how to resist the Athenians. Athenagoras, who's described as a demagogue, very similar language as used to describe him, as was used to describe Cleon in earlier books of Thucydides, and an anonymous Syracuse in general as well. So I probably would read that as well, get the pupils to read that, and potentially cite examples from it or refer to it in essays. I think it is highly relevant to the sorts of questions you're likely to get asked. As Connor says in his book, we have traveled to Syracuse and found Athens. It's nicely phrased. Athenians arrive in Sicily. The Egestaeans deceive Athens, very amusing passage that I won't go into detail now. We then reach the group 2 prescription, which is, first of all, the Council of War, really interesting. Nicias, Alcibiades, and Lamachus all have different ideas about how to proceed. That in itself is perhaps a little worrying, but they're interesting passages, and you can get a good debate going about which one would you have done. It opens up into, invites you to consider the expedition from a more ancient historical perspective rather than the historiographical one. And then pretty soon, Alcibiades gets recalled to Athens because of this lingering charge about having parodied the Eleusinian mysteries. And then over half of the prescription, group 2 prescription, is this excursus on the last phase of the Paisos tyranny at Athens. So if you would get to choose this group 2 prescription, you would be choosing it because you think that's great. And it is great. It's just maybe not wholly typical of Thucydides' wider work. I'll mention a bit more of that in a second. And then it really finishes with a bit more about what the Athenian response to the parody of the mysteries and the mutilation of the Herms. And that's the end of the Thucydides A-level prescription. Okay, so let's go back to look at the group 1 prescription in a bit more detail. To begin with, you have the speech of Nicias, and the obvious themes to look at here are how Nicias is characterized, and you really get a strong sense of his personality. which is in some respects quite attractive, in some respects less so. It's certainly a very complex character. And you can also analyze his speech from a rhetorical perspective. He's definitely got a purpose in mind, which is trying to put the Athenians off. You can see from that quotation that he's deploying a trick that's straight out of the rhetorical manuals. This Rhetorica ad Alexandrum was passed down with Aristotle's works, but it's not thought to be behind him. But you can see he's trying to persuade someone not to do something because it is laborious and not necessary. Okay, so it's going to be a gift if it comes up as a passage, because you can analyze the rhetoric of it all. But obviously he's saying this is a big undertaking. We've got to be really careful with it. So it also ties into the theme that the Sicilian expedition is a really dangerous prospect for Athens. After that, you get the backfiring of the speech and the sort of pressing on with preparations for the expedition. So I mentioned before, you have a lovely depiction of the heterogeneity of Athenian society, and you also have this wonderful list of the different types of military force that are going to be called up, the hoplites illustrated here, and so on. Interesting few chapters. Again, the characterization of Nicias and the presentation of the decision as one that's perhaps, well, definitely the Athenians are too gung-ho about. Those are probably the themes that dominate in that part of the prescription. Then you have this really interesting bit, the mutilation of the Herms. Now, I know you've been thinking, or maybe you know already, what is a Herm? Well, we've got two pictures of Herms here. We're talking statues, semi-statues of that would have existed primarily outside houses in Athens, private houses. A good number of them in Athens, maybe most would have had them. They had apotropaic properties. They're supposed to ward off evil spirits and disease and this sort of thing. So a block of stone with a head on the top, often of Hermes, but not always. On the right, that's actually Demosthenes' head. So this is not from the 5th century. Obviously, this is from the 4th century or later. And also an erect phallus, right? So you can see that very clearly. So when we talk about the mutilation of the Herms, what are we talking about? Well, Thucydides says that people mutilated the faces. We think that is correct. And there's a lovely vase from, not one I've got depicted here, from early in the 5th century of a satyr actually mutilating the face of a Herm. So this is obviously something that was done. But we know from this little extract from Aristophanes' Lysistrata that in the famous mutilation of the Herms 415 BC, the erect phalluses were also knocked off, at least some of them, probably the ones where they hadn't been knocked off already or fallen off already. So that's what the Herms are. And then the mysteries, this is not necessarily a connected thing. The Eleusinian mysteries are these sacred rites in honor of the mother and the maid, that is to say Demeter and Persephone, that were celebrated at Eleusis, just west of Athens. And first of all, the Herms are mutilated, and there's a great big panic because people think it might be presaging some sort of political revolution to suppress the democracy. People are told to come forward. Nobody comes forward about the Herms. People do come forward to say there has been a parodying of the mysteries in private homes, and Alcibiades is implicated in that. So what am I trying to say? The whole description gives an amazing insight into Greek religion, politics, society, and the sort of febrile atmosphere at this crucial moment when the expedition is about to be set out. So it's a really interesting episode, and I'm sure you'd have lots to say about it. Finally, you have this description of the departure of the fleet, and Hornblower in his commentary has a really interesting section at the beginning where he talks about the possible units of Thucydides that may have been performed as extracts, particularly in like a symposium context. And this makes the list. It is a very, very vivid description of all the fleet lining up ready to go, and of the population of Athens coming out to watch it, being impressed, but at the same time realizing that this is a very, very serious undertaking, and having some second thoughts. This could go very badly wrong, as indeed does. And a clear passage you want to compare and contrast it with is the very end of book 7, where Thucydides describes the last word on the Sicilian expedition. I can't resist reading it in the Hammond translation. This proved the most significant occurrence in the whole of this war, and it seems to me in the whole of recorded Greek history. Unparalleled triumph for the victors, and unparalleled disaster for the vanquished. This was, as they say, total annihilation. Beaten in every way on every front, extreme miseries suffered on an extreme scale, and army, fleet, and everything else destroyed. Few out of all those many made their return home. Such were the events in Sicily. So once you've read that passage, compare it with that one I've just read to you, and it is quite an extraordinary comparison. The pride before the fall. So the themes. You get a strong sense of the scale of the expedition, the significance of the dispatch of the expedition. Athens, maybe perhaps the whole war effort is going to depend on this. And obviously you want to play this wonderful video of the Trireme Olympias with its amazing soundtrack when talking about triremes. Can't miss that. Okay, I'm not going to talk about group 2 in anything like the same detail. I do want to just say a tiny bit about this dominating passage of the excursus on the last phase of the Pisistrated tyranny. It's a great piece of Thucydides, but I would argue not desperately typical of his work. He does do other excursuses, but this one in particular is highly Herodotean in flavour. It's often noted. He's even citing his sources and talking about how his sources support the views that he has, which is not something that Thucydides does elsewhere in his work. And it's quite difficult because it seems like the most random digression on first reading. But if you think really hard about it, / read the commentaries, you start to see that there are lots and lots of points of comparison between this excursus and the main narrative of the Sicilian expedition. And therefore, if you are teaching group 2, I strongly recommend you read the Hornblower discussion of the various scholarship on this. And I also really recommend you read Connor on this. He's really good at showing the possible comparisons between the narrative and the excursus. Passages you will definitely want to check out. It's the second time that Thucydides actually talks about this episode in Athenian history. And Herodotus has also done excursus on it as well. So you'll want to have a look at that for sure. Okay, just finally, a few words on possible questions. Seems to me the obvious place to start with these is to look at the previous prescription of Thucydides that was set in this syllabus, and that is the Pylos episode from Pylos campaign from book 4 of Thucydides. So these 4 questions you can readily imagine apply to different parts of book 6 with a few words changed. What makes this passage so memorable, a picture of Athenian democracy in action? Well, you could probably have that about, for example, the reaction to Nicias's second speech. How does Thucydides make this description vivid? Well, that one is likely to come up in one of the 2 years, isn't it? Perhaps about the departure of the fleet in chapter 30 to 32. But I'm sure there are lots of other possible candidates for that. In this passage, how effectively does Thucydides convey the despondency in Athens at this time? My reaction to that one is, well, maybe the mutilation of the Herms. In this passage, how effectively does Thucydides convey the panic in Athens at this time, in the response to the mutilation of the Herms? In this passage, how does Thucydides convey the difficulties which Demosthenes' tactics will cause for the Spartans? Well, yeah, I'm sure that could be adapted too. So I just wanted to show you a few types of questions that have appeared in the past, and then you can have fun with recasting them for the passages that appear in our prescription. Looking at the essays, these are the two essays that came up for Thucydides 4. How good is Thucydides at explaining the reasons for the actions and the causes of the events that he describes in his account of the Pylos campaign? Now, I'd have looked at that essay and thought, I'll do the other one. I think that'd be a really hard essay to answer, but you could recast it for Thucydides 6 quite easily. I still think it'd be a hard question, which is why I think it's really important to have been prepared to do two different texts. It's not so hard to do. Thucydides' account of the Pylos campaign is a masterpiece of narrative. Discuss. Well, that could so easily be recast for book 6, and that would be a gift of the question. It's definitely one I would do maybe as a homework thematic essay, do in advance. Did a bit more brainstorming, came up with 3 questions in the style of the sort of questions you get at A-level. Thucydides presents the Athenian expedition to Sicily as a disaster waiting to happen. To what extent do you agree with this view? Some sort of question about how the expedition seems like it's slightly doomed from the start. That is a big theme in the first 3/5 of book 6. Alcibiades / Nicias is portrayed wholly negatively by Thucydides in the first half of book 6. Do you agree? So some sort of question on characterization of either Alcibiades or Nicias, or potentially both. Clearly, I don't think that they're portrayed, either is portrayed wholly negatively by Thucydides, but it's quite good to have a question that demands a response that is quite extreme in its view. So yeah, definitely one to consider. And then perhaps a little bit less bread and butter, what picture emerges from Thucydides' narrative at the beginning of the Sicilian expedition of Athenian politics and society in the late 5th century BC? There's a lot that could feed into that, whether above all the stuff on the Herms, the mysteries and so on, but also the debate and the reaction to the speeches, the decision to go to Sicily. Okay, how would I advise you got your pupils to answer the questions? Well, I think there's a huge variety of approach, and what I'll actually just say is a good place to go is the candidate exemplars on the OCR website. So you can read a few different pupil responses, see how they've been marked, see what the examiners have had to say about them. So there are quite a few of those to look over. And then you can do the same for essays as well as commentaries, of course, and indeed the shorter questions. And the final thing I would offer is some ideas for extensions, particularly with the EPQ. If your school does the EPQ, wouldn't it be great to say to your pupils, you can follow up what you've done with your set texts in quite interesting ways. So 3 ideas. The first one might be, how does Thucydides compare with Plutarch, Nicias and Alcibiades? This is quite good because you'd only have to read those 3 books really, or 3 texts, 2 of which are very short, all of which are very short, in order to do justice to this. And your pupils will notice quite quickly that there's a world of difference between the biography of Plutarch and the history of Thucydides. And then what's really interesting is there's a huge difference between how all of the Sicilian expedition is presented between Nicias and Alcibiades. So that could be great and very satisfying if the other text that you're doing is the group 2 Alcibiades text of Plutarch. So that's historiography. If you want to do something a bit more ancient history focused, you could look at inscriptions, and there are several that are relevant in Rhodes and Osborne there. And there's also some good stuff on the Attic Inscriptions Online website. Or you could take a sort of even broader approach and look at the whole expedition and say, why did the Athenian expedition to Sicily fail? I'm sure there are other questions besides. You could look at the importance of speeches in book 6. You could look at the relationship between Thucydides and tragedy, Thucydides and Homer, back on the historiography side, but that gives you a lot to play with. All right, well, I hope some of that was useful at least, and I hope at the very least I haven't put anyone off from studying this text at A level. That Group 1 text in particular is golden and will be a wonderful introduction to Thucydides. So, such were events in Sicily. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.